right now we're at the point where we've probably bought all the material we need to buy for our cabinet project. In the last lesson, we talked about where to get the material, plywood, hardwood. So I'm assuming that you've gone out, or you're planning on going out and buying all the material, all your sheets of plywood. You're going to stack them in your workshop, your garage, or your basement. You get your hardwood to the side, and I wanted to discuss how to attack the cuts on your plywood. So I'm assuming you're going to be using some sort of cut sheet program or some type of cut sheets. Now, we discussed Optimalon and Cabinet Planner. There's Cut Plus, excuse me, Cut Plus Pro or whatever. So you can draw this out by hand. But the first thing I want to tell you is don't make the mistake of drawing all of these little grids out on the sheet of plywood. It's very tempting to do that. Don't do that. The reason is if you make just a very minor error between what you draw and what you cut, then it can throw off everything else and it can just become confusing. So what we're going to do is use the measurements of our tape measure and our table saw fence to correctly measure this out. We're not going to draw on here. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what gets cut first. And to cut out sheets of plywood, we're going to be using two tools. We're going to be using our circular saw, and we're going to be using our table saw. And I'm going to show you how I cut these using a circular saw in just a minute. But first, I'm going to discuss how do I attack this cut sheet. So I've got all these parts here. What do I do first, and what's the good strategy for cutting these out? It's very easy to do, and these are just straight cuts. So if you can cut a straight line with a circular saw or with a table saw, and I will show you how to do that, then this part is very, very easy. We don't spend a lot of time in the course on making very basic cuts like cutting out pieces of plywood because it's pretty straightforward, but we will cover it. So the first thing I'm going to do is look at this sheet, and just so you're wondering, this sheet is the 3/4 inch thick 4x8 sheet of plywood we're using for the cherry cabinet project in this course. And I've got two bottom sides, top sides, bottom, all this other stuff on here. So what I'm going to do is I want to look for one long continuous cut that either goes down the whole length or cuts it across in one cut. So I don't have any long vertical cuts in this piece that go from all the way from the top to all the way to the bottom. I've got one that's close, but if you look, there's a little bit of a discontinuity here, so I can't put this on the table saw and run this through, at least not according to this cut sheet. Maybe if I were to try to move in these pieces around, if that were an option, maybe I could do that. But by looking at this drawing, that's not clear to me. What is clear to me is there is a horizontal cut. There's a line here that cuts all the way through, and I don't see any other through cuts. So this is automatically the first cut I'd make. And because it's across the width of the plywood, I would be using this. I would be making this cut on a circular saw. So I'd line this up, make the cut. I'd put these two pieces to the side, and then I'd look at what's remaining, which is down here and again up here. So I have now two big pieces. So what's left? Well, I can cut these two in half. Probably do that on the table saw. Are there any other cuts I can make in the circular saw while I have it out? Well, the next cut for this big bottom section here is this long vertical line. That's a cut I could do with the circular saw or with the table saw. It's a lot easier to make this cut on the table saw because it's down the length of this board. One thing you do need to be careful of. Okay, so when we drop this on the table saw and we want to cut this line, pop quiz, what do I set my fence to make sure this cut gets cut out? Well, you could be thinking, well, there's an 11.5 piece here and an 11.5 inch piece here. I just add those up. That's 23 inches between here and here. So there's 23 inches from here to here. So if I set my fence to 23 inches and make my cut, I should be good, right? Wrong. In here you have an additional cut, and we lose material when we pass this piece through the blade. So we lose 1/8 of an inch. That's how thick the blade is. That's how much material the blade removes when it passes through this cut. So I have to account for that. So an 11.5 inches plus 11.5 inches plus 1/8 gets me over here. So that's 23 1/8 inches. Because I have some extra room over here and down here, I can actually set this to 23 1/2, something a little higher and give me a little more margin of error. But that's what I would do in the table saw, set my fence, drop this big piece on there, and then make this long cut here. After that long cut, I can then move into my other cuts. This is a cross piece here I would make with a circular saw. This is a circular saw cut. This is a circular saw cut. This is a table saw cut. This is a table saw cut. So anything across the width is going to be circular saw, probably. Anything down the length that's long will be a table saw. And the reason I'm doing that, it's just because it's much safer to make these long cuts in the table saw than it is to try to make cross cuts where you're pushing through the wide section through the blade. It's not really as safe as pushing the length through it. So that's how I'm pretty much attacking this sheet of plywood, and I'm going to do this approach to every sheet in my cut sheet inventory. So one thing you want to be careful of, or in a general approach that will help you speed this up, will be to stick with one tool at a time. So try to make all your circular saw cuts at once if you can, or easily cut. You want to easily switch from one to the other, but it's annoying if you have 10 sheets of plywood to keep going from circular saw to table saw to circular saw to table saw. You kind of want to be efficient as you cut these out, and maybe try to do as many circular saw cuts as once and then as many table saw cuts as once. The other thing I will tell you is label each piece as you make the final cut. So I've cut this big top part out. I make my passes on the table saw and cut these two pieces out. I'm going to put a piece of painter's tape on here, and with a Sharpie or whatever, I'm going to write bottom sides, cabinet number 1 or something on there, or maybe 1 tack bottom sides, however you want to, whatever nomenclature you want to use, that when you start throwing these in piles, because that's what you want to do, you want to cut them out, put them in piles for each particular cabinet. So since I'm only making 1 cabinet in this particular sheet, all of these pieces would go in 1 pile, and that would be the pile for that cabinet. All right, so it's critical that you don't just have a big old pile of wood and then have to figure out later, wait, what piece is that for? Oh crap. Now you want to label these as you make the final cut on them, and they go into a pile. That's the way to do it. So let's take a break here. I'm going to shoot over to this circular saw, and I'm going to show you how to make a circular saw cut. So I'm getting set up for my first cut here on the plywood. This is my birch sheet, and so according to my cut sheet, I have 2 cuts to make horizontally before I can start cutting these into some other sections. So to do this, I'm going to be using my circular saw. I just wanted to show you a couple things in case this stuff wasn't very obvious to you. I have the birch plywood propped up under over some 2x4s. It gets it off the table, and it allows my circular saw, as I push through it, the blade to go completely through the plywood without damaging any of the cutting surface below. The next thing you need to do here is to make sure you space out those 2x4s properly. And if I'm going to be making, actually my first cut is about 31 inches down, and as I start cutting through here, okay, with my circular saw from one side to the next, actually, I don't want the end that's getting cut off to cantilever off. Okay, so what could happen is, as I'm pushing through here with this saw, if this board isn't supported on the cut side, so you should have a board on either side of the board you're cutting, 2x4 on either side of the cut mark. And as you cut through it, as this board starts to drop off, the 2x4 will support it. If you don't support it, and if you don't have anything under the board you're cutting off, so as you cut this board is going to then want to drop. Okay, and as it drops, it's actually going to pinch this blade. It's going to pinch the blade on your circular saw, and it's going to kind of touch the bottom, and what'll happen is that it'll jam the blade, and the blade will actually the saw will want to jump out of your hands and jump off the board. And it's not safe, it's not a great situation, so you really just need to alleviate that by having it cantilevered and supported properly. So what I'll do is I'm going to use a tape measure and measure out where the first mark is, okay? And in this case it's 31 inches. And since I'm using my circular saw, for a straight cut with a circular saw, a straight and accurate cut, I actually want to run the edge of the circular saw against some sort of straight edge. So what I'll do is I measure the difference between the edge of the circular saw and where the blade actually is, and for my particular circular saw, that's 1.25 inches. So for instance, my first cut is 31 inches down. So I'm going to measure 31 inches, and then I'll either add or subtract depending upon where I want the cut, what side I'll come at it. So I'll do it this side twice coming from that side. So I'll mark 31 inches, and then I'll add 1.25 inches, and then I'll move a straight edge to that 31 plus 1.25, which is 32.25. So I'll move this straight edge to 32.25, and then I have something to push against the circular saw against. So I'll have a nice straight, clean cut. If I'm concerned about tear out at all, and this saw kind of tearing up the edges, I can lay down a piece of painter's tape on that line and kind of eliminate that issue as well. So those are the kind of things you need to worry about and think about once you start getting set up with these cross-board circular saw cuts. Unfortunately, unless you have a panel saw, which most people aren't going to have, you end up needing to make these cuts on with the circular saw. You can't cut these. You can't cut like this. You can't push this big plywood board through on a table saw. At least on most people's table saws, it's just not a safe thing to do. So I'm going to go get set up for this and show you what that looks like.
Okay, let's zoom in on this cut line. Now I've measured 31 inches, and in this case I actually want the straight edge to be on the right side. So I measured out 31 inches and wrote down C next to the line that is actually the cut line of 31 inches. I then measured out 1.25 inches to correspond to where the straight edge will line up against. I'll repeat these two measurements on the other side of the plywood sheet, and I'm good to go. So this is a straight edge product I really like. I will post a link to it in the lesson notes. It clamps down, it's adjustable, and it works great with either a circular saw or a router. Big fan of this. So for a table saw cut, we want to make sure our fence is locked into the position we need it in, and it's firm and it's not going to move if we bump it. I'm going to be wearing hearing and eye protection as well. And generally I want to stand near the fence or in front of the fence, but not usually directly in front of the blade or to the left of the blade. I'm going to guide the workpiece in and make sure it's firm against the fence. Once I push the piece through, I'm going to basically turn the machine off, let it come to a complete stop before I remove that scrap piece. So you can see the benefit here of having an extended work table, so these pieces you cut are supported. I'm using a kickstand type device here to help me stabilize this piece before I push it through. Now this piece actually is a little wider than it is longer, or it's longer than it is wider, and I'm pushing it through on the wide side. This is generally a preferred way of doing this. But just wanted to show you what it's like if you don't have an extra set of hands, and one of those stands comes in real handy. But again, pushing the pieces through, once I get it through the blade, I'm going to put my side I'm keeping, I'm going to push that out of the way, and then reach down and turn the saw off before I touch anything else. I'll let that blade come to a complete stop.